All right, so we're back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at Genesis 23. You know, the chapter where Abraham buys that Cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah. It sounds like just a simple real estate deal, right? But I have a feeling there's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah.
I mean, what makes this purchase more than just a transaction?
Right.
You know, what can it tell us about Abraham and his faith and his journey in the Promised Land?
Well, I think it's really interesting that this whole thing happens in Hebron, you know, right in the middle of Canaan.
Okay.
And this is where Sarah, Abraham's wife, dies at 127 years old.
Wow.
And that's what leads Abraham to the Hittites. The Hittites were kind of the big players in that region at that time, and he needed a burial place for Sarah.
You know, I think it's important for us to remember how important owning land was back then. I mean, it wasn't just about like having a place to live or bury your loved ones. It was about making a statement, you know, putting down roots, building a legacy, securing a future for your descendants. It was a huge deal.
Absolutely. And, God promised this land, this specific land, to Abraham and his descendants.
Right.
But think about this. At this point in the story, Abraham doesn't own any of it, not a single piece. So this encounter with the Hittites, because of Sarah's death, becomes a pivotal moment for Abraham. It's his chance to finally establish a physical presence in the Promised Land.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, we're not talking about just some random group of people here. The Hittites had a certain, I don't know, reputation, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They were known for their really organized legal and commercial systems. So dealing with them, it wasn't a walk in the park. You know, they had their own laws, their own customs, and their own way of doing business. To work with them, you needed a really delicate balance of respect and diplomacy, maybe even a little bit of cleverness.
I can only imagine.
Wow.
So Abraham needs a place to bury Sarah, and he's facing this group, this formidable group, the Hittites. And the text tells us that he goes to them humbly, calling himself a stranger and sojourner in their land. What do you think? Why did he choose that approach?
Well, right off the bat, he's acknowledging he's an outsider. I think it's a smart move, you know. He's showing respect, trying to get on their good side. He's not coming in making demands or trying to throw his weight around. He's presenting himself as someone who needs their help, which, I mean, given the situation, is the truth.
Right. And it seems like that approach maybe worked, because the next thing we hear is this Hittite, Ephron. He offers Abraham the Cave of Machpelah for free. It sounds almost too good to be true. Was that a genuine offer? What do you make of that?
This is where understanding the culture back then is so important. It may seem like a nice, selfless gesture, but this type of offer, it was a common way to start a negotiation.
Oh, interesting.
It was like the first move in this intricate dance of bargaining, setting the stage for what would come next.
Okay, so not a freebie then. But here's where I get a little confused. If it wasn't a real gift, why not just take it?
Yeah.
Why insist on paying? What was Abraham thinking?
I know, it's a question that makes you think, right? It seems like accepting would have been so much easier. But Abraham had his reasons.
Okay, so tell me, what were those reasons?
Well, scholars usually point to three main reasons. First, Abraham was thinking ahead, way ahead.
Okay.
He wanted to own the land without question, and just a verbal agreement that wouldn't do it. By paying, he was making it a legally binding deal so there wouldn't be any arguments later on. He was protecting his family's future.
Ah, so it's like getting it all in writing.
Exactly. No confusion, no strings attached. This cave would be his family's, no question. But there's another aspect to this, something deeper. Remember how we talked about God promising Abraham this land for him and his descendants? By buying the cave, Abraham was showing his faith in that promise.
Right.
It was like a powerful statement, a physical action that backed up his belief that God would keep his word even though he was still a stranger in this land.
So it's like he's putting his money where his mouth is.
Yeah.
A bold move.
Yeah.
But he said there were three reasons. What's the third?
The third reason, it ties the first two together perfectly, I think. Abraham wanted to keep things peaceful with the Hittites. By paying a fair price, he was taking away any chance of them feeling tricked or resentful. He was building a bridge, creating goodwill that would hopefully benefit his descendants later on.
Wow, he was really playing the long game.
He was.
It shows incredible foresight and a genuine desire for peace. But then things get a little complicated. The price tag for this cave is a whopping 400 shekels of silver. That was a lot of money back then. I mean, it almost feels like Ephron might be trying to take advantage of Abraham's grief, you know?
Yeah, you're right. It does raise some questions. Some scholars think Ephron was definitely bumping up the price, knowing that Abraham was in a tough spot.
So what did Abraham do? Did he try to negotiate? Did he try to get a better price?
This is what's amazing. Abraham doesn't even flinch. He pays the full price. No complaints.
Now that says a lot about his integrity. It's powerful. Even when he's faced with what seems like an unfair deal, he chooses to do the right thing, the honorable thing. And that brings us to a bigger question. What makes this purchase so important? Why does this story still matter to us thousands of years later?
This wasn't just about getting a burial plot. It was way more than that. This purchase, even with the possibly inflated price, was a turning point in the story of Abraham and his descendants.
Okay.
It was the first piece of the promised land that truly belonged to them, a real physical step towards God's covenant being fulfilled.
So it's like a down payment on the future, a way of saying we're here and we're here to stay.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. This cave, the Cave of Machpelah, becomes so much more than just Sarah's burial place. It's where Abraham himself is eventually buried, and then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Leah too.
Whoa, so we're talking about the final resting place for the patriarchs and matriarchs of the entire Israelite nation. It becomes like the patriarchal family tomb.
Right, precisely. And that makes it even more significant.
Wow.
It becomes a symbol of lineage and heritage, a concrete example of how God's promise continues across generations. This seemingly simple purchase of land becomes this incredibly powerful symbol of faith and legacy.
It's amazing how this story unfolds, from a seemingly straightforward land deal to this profound exploration of faith, integrity, and leaving a legacy.
It is, isn't it? And it makes you wonder, what stands out to you in this story? What are the key things we can learn from what Abraham did, from his approach, his faith, his integrity? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question for all of us listening too. What about you? What jumps out at you? What can we all take away from Abraham's actions? How can we apply those lessons to our own lives?
Well, one of the most powerful lessons for me is that faith isn't passive. Abraham didn't just sit around waiting for God's promise to magically happen. He took action. He stepped out in faith, trusting God even when the way forward wasn't clear.
Yeah, he was an active participant in how that promise unfolded.
Exactly. And even when he was faced with what seemed like an unfair price, he didn't waver in his integrity. He didn't compromise his values just to get a better deal, which makes me think, how often do we find ourselves in situations where doing what's right might cost us something, where it would be easier to take a shortcut? Abraham's story is a reminder that integrity matters. It's worth the cost, especially when we're thinking about the legacy we want to leave for the generations after us.
That's such an important reminder, especially these days. Integrity, standing by your principles. It may not always be easy, but it's the right thing to do.
For sure. And there's one more thing about this story that I find really moving. Abraham bought a burial plot, a place for the dead. But in doing that, he was investing in a future he wouldn't even see. He was planting a seed, believing that it would grow into something amazing, even though he wouldn't be around to witness it. That's what faith in action looks like, isn't it?
It really is. He put his trust in God's timing, trusting that a plan was unfolding that stretched far beyond his own life. And that brings us to a question for you, our listener. What seeds are you planting today?
Yeah.
What actions are you taking that might not show results right away, but will have a lasting impact on the future? What kind of legacy are you creating, not just for yourself, but for the generations that come after you? It's something to really think about, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's one of the most powerful messages from this story.
Okay.
Even small actions, like buying a piece of land for a burial place, can have huge consequences that reach far beyond our own lifetimes. We're all connected to something bigger than ourselves. It's a story that keeps unfolding long after we're gone.
Wow, so much to think about from just one chapter in Genesis. We started with what seemed like a simple land purchase and ended up on this incredible journey exploring faith, integrity, and building a legacy.
It's amazing what a little digging can uncover.
It really is.
Yeah.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover in this fascinating story. Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into Genesis 23 and explore even more layers of meaning and relevance.
You know what's really wild? This cave, the Cave of Machpelah, is still around today.
Seriously? You mean we can actually go see the place where this all happened? No way.
Yeah. It's in Hebron, in the West Bank. And get this, it's a sacred spot for both Jews and Muslims. One place, holy to two major world religions.
That is incredible. It really makes this whole story come alive.
It does.
It connects this ancient story to the present day. It makes me think, what would it have been like to actually be there back then with Abraham, watching this deal go down? Do we know anything about the caves itself? Like, what did it look like?
Well, from what archaeologists have found and from historical accounts, it seems like the Cave of Machpelah was this naturally formed cave, pretty big inside, and back then, using caves for burials was pretty standard. The fact that it was a cave, not some fancy tomb above ground, adds another layer of symbolism to the story, don't you think?
Oh, I totally agree. It makes me think about going down into the earth, returning to where we came from. It's almost like a symbolic return to the womb. It's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah. It is. And caves were seen as mysterious places in ancient cultures. People thought of them as places full of secrets, even gateways to the underworld sometimes. So choosing a cave as a burial site would have been a really significant decision, not just for practical reasons, but for symbolic ones too.
And this isn't just any cave, right? This cave became super important for generations. It became the resting place for all those patriarchs and matriarchs, the very foundation of the Israelite nation. It's a real testament to the impact of Abraham's decision to secure this place for his family, a place that ended up meaning so much more than just a burial spot.
Exactly. And the fact that it's still there today, a place people visit and revere, it really speaks to how powerful this story is. It bridges the gap between ancient history and now, showing us how these stories still shape how we understand faith, heritage, and that deep connection between people and land.
It makes me think about how the choices we make today, the things we stand for, can have a similar ripple effect. Maybe we're not buying caves or starting nations, but we're all leaving our mark on the world in some way, right? We're all part of this bigger story that stretches across generations.
That's a really good point. It raises an interesting question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What are the choices we're making now that will shape the future for the people who come after us? What kind of legacy are we leaving behind, whether we mean to or not? Something to think about.
It really is. And it's kind of a challenge, too. It encourages us to live with purpose, to think beyond just our immediate needs, and consider how what we do will affect things in the long run. It's about realizing we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even actions that seem small, like Abraham buying this cave, can have these huge consequences, practical and spiritual. It's about understanding that our lives are all woven together with the people who came before us and the people who come after us.
For me, one of the things that stands out in this whole story is the trust involved. Abraham was acting on this promise, a promise that wouldn't even fully come true for generations. He was buying a burial plot, but he was really investing in a future that he wouldn't even get to see. It takes a huge amount of faith to do something like that, to act on a vision that goes way beyond your own lifetime.
It does. It speaks to the power of believing in something bigger than yourself, something beyond just what you need or want right now. And it shows us how important it is to actually do something, to take action, even when you don't see the results right away. Abraham could have waited, he could have doubted, but he chose to act on his faith, and that act had huge consequences, not just for him, but for all the generations that came after him.
It's like a reminder that sometimes the most important actions are the ones that require us to take that leap of faith, that willingness to trust in a future we can't completely see or control. And it makes me think about the promises we hold dear in our own lives, the hopes and dreams we have for ourselves and the people we care about. What are we actually doing to make those promises a reality? What seeds of faith are we planting now that might not fully bloom for years, maybe even decades?
That's a great question. It encourages us to think long-term, to think about what we want to leave behind, the impact we want to have on the world now and in the future.
And it reminds us that even the most ordinary actions, like buying a piece of land for a burial place, can have these huge ripple effects. They become part of history and shape what happens for generations to come. It's a pretty humbling thought, and it pushes us to live our lives with purpose, knowing that our choices matter, knowing that we're all part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
I totally agree. It makes you wonder what other hidden treasures of wisdom are buried in the Bible, just waiting for us to discover them.
I know, right? And that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to dig up these timeless truths and connect them to our lives today. It's like we're on an archaeological dig, sifting through all these layers of history and meaning, finding treasures that have been hidden for centuries. And with every discovery, we understand not only the past better, but also ourselves and our place in the bigger picture of everything.
That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of uncovering treasures, there's one more part of this story that I think we need to look at. We've talked about the purchase the cave, the legacy. But what about the price itself? Those 400 shekels of silver. That wasn't just a random number, right? What can we learn from that specific detail?
You're right, that price is important. It wasn't just about the money. It was a statement. And to really get what it meant, we need to dig a little deeper into the culture and economy back then.
Okay, I'm ready to dig.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So let's start with how valuable silver was in those days. Silver was precious, used as money, jewelry, and for religious things. It represented wealth, status, power. So 400 shekels of silver, that was a serious amount of money, especially for someone like Abraham, who was a nomad, a herder.
So it wasn't just spare change, that's for sure. But was it actually a fair price for a burial plot? Or was Ephron, like we talked about before, maybe trying to trick Abraham?
That's a question that scholars have been arguing about for centuries.
Oh, wow.
Some people say Ephron was definitely inflating the price, taking advantage of Abraham's grief and desperation. They point to how he first offered the cave for free, but then came back asking for a huge payment.
Yeah, that does seem kind of shady, like he was trying to pull a bait and switch.
Yeah, it does. But other scholars say that the price, while high, wasn't totally out of line.
Okay.
They say that you have to consider the location and size of the cave, and the fact that it could be a family tomb for generations.
So maybe Ephron was playing hardball, but not necessarily being dishonest.
Right. And it's interesting that Abraham, who was known for being a good businessman, didn't argue about the price. He paid it willingly, no complaints.
Which, again, says a lot about his character,
Wow.
right? He was committed to doing things the right way, even if it cost him a lot of money. But I'm still curious about what the price itself meant, like symbolically. What message do you think it was sending?
That's where things get really fascinating. Remember how we talked about owning land? It wasn't just about owning the actual piece of ground. It was about establishing roots, claiming a legacy, securing a future for your people. The price Abraham paid for the Cave of Machpelah, you could see it as a symbol of the sacrifice needed to achieve those things.
So it's not just about the money itself. It's about showing commitment, being willing to invest in something that will last beyond your own lifetime.
Exactly. And it speaks to the idea that things that are truly valuable, they usually come with a cost. Nothing worth having is ever really free.
That's really profound. It applies to so much more than just owning land, right? It makes me think about the sacrifices we make in our own lives, how much we invest in our relationships, our careers, our communities. We often have to give something up to pay a price, to achieve something truly meaningful.
Definitely. Sometimes that price is about money, but a lot of times it's about something more than that, something harder to measure, like time, energy, emotional investment. But the idea is the same. We have to be willing to put something on the line, to really commit if we want to build something that will last.
It's like that saying, you get out what you put in. And in Abraham's case, he was definitely putting a lot in, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
He was investing his wealth, but also his faith, his integrity, and his vision for the future.
And that investment, that willingness to pay the price, it resulted in a legacy that has lasted for thousands of years. It reminds us that what we invest in today can shape not just our own lives, but the lives of generations to come.
You know, as we've been talking about this story, one thing that keeps hitting me is just how strong Abraham's faith was. I mean, he was thinking and acting on a time scale that most of us can't even imagine. Investing in a future that was generations away, a future he knew he wouldn't even live to see.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. It really makes you question how we view time and planning today. We tend to be so focused on the immediate, the stuff we can see and touch, the things we feel like we have control over. But Abraham was playing a completely different game. He was on God's timetable, trusting in this vision that went way beyond his own lifespan.
And that brings us to a big question for everyone listening. What does it really mean to have that kind of faith? What does it actually look like to live with that kind of long-term perspective, that unshakable trust in a future that we can't even wrap our minds around?
Yeah, that's a question worth thinking about. I think for me, it starts with realizing that real faith, it's not just about believing in something, it's about acting on what you believe. It's about making your actions match your deepest convictions, even when you don't see the results right away.
So it's not just about having a belief system, it's about actually living it out, making choices that reflect those beliefs, even when it's tough, even when you have to sacrifice something.
Exactly. It's about saying, I trust in this vision, in this promise, and I'm going to live like it's true, even if it takes years, even generations, for the whole thing to become clear.
You know, it makes me think of that parable of the mustard seed. That tiny little seed, almost nothing on its own, can grow into this massive tree that shelters and feeds all kinds of creatures. But it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes faith in that unseen process of growth.
That's such a great comparison. It reminds us that sometimes the biggest acts of faith are those where we just plant the seeds, where we invest in a future that we might not even live to experience. We have to trust that something good and powerful will come out of it.
So how do we actually apply that to our own lives? I mean, we're not patriarchs buying caves. We're living this crazy, fast-paced world where everything is about instant gratification. How do we cultivate that kind of long-term vision, that patient trust in something bigger than ourselves?
It's tough, for sure. But I think it starts with figuring out what really matters to you.
Okay.
What do you believe in? What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? Just like Abraham was driven by his faith in God's promise, we need to have our own guiding vision, a set of values that shape our choices and show us where we're going.
So it's about getting clear on our own personal promise. Figuring out what we're aiming for, what we're willing to really invest in, even if we don't see the rewards immediately.
Exactly. It's about strengthening that trust muscle, that willingness to take a leap of faith, to plant those seeds even when we can't see the harvest coming. It's about understanding that real growth often happens beneath the surface, in those quiet, unseen parts of our hearts and souls.
And remember that we're not just living for ourselves, we're all part of a bigger story, a chain of events that connects generations. The things we do today have the power to shape the future, to create ripples that last way beyond our own lives. That's both humbling and incredibly empowering.
It really is. It tells us that we're not just passive observers in this whole grand scheme of things. We have the power to choose, to act, to create, to make a mark on the world that will last even after we're gone. That's where the real legacy is. Not in the stuff we gather, but in the values we live by, the love we give, the seeds of hope and possibility that we plant for those coming after us.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Genesis 23, I want to leave you with this. What seeds are you planting today? What kind of legacy are you building? What steps are you taking to create a future filled with hope, meaning, and possibility for yourself and for others? It's a question worth thinking about, and it's a journey worth taking.
That's beautifully said. And remember, even the tiniest seed, planted with intention and nurtured with faith, has the potential to grow into something amazing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And thank you for listening. We hope this exploration has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to take a closer look at your own life, your own beliefs, and your own legacy. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. And be sure to share this episode with anyone who might find it interesting or helpful. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.